Hello and welcome to another Econelastic video. Hope you are all well. In our previous video, we combined our analysis of the demand and supply curves and explained how an equilibrium point is reached. However, an equilibrium is very unlikely to stay static forever. And in this video, we are going to go into how changes in demand or changes in supply can cause a movement to a new equilibrium point.
So, an equilibrium point will only remain unchanged if we experience no change in either the demand or the supply curves. Therefore, if a factor other than price causes either curve to shift, then a new equilibrium point will be reached.
Yeah, so we'll start by describing the process behind a change in demand. As we've covered in our demand curve properties, which is linked in the description below, when any of the determinants of demand other than price changes, then the demand curves will shift. Logically then, if the demand curve shifts, it will now intersect the supply curve at a different point. And you'll be able to see this more clearly on the graph on your screen.
So we start this graph in the same way as we start a lot of our economics graphs. That's with price on the y-axis. So price and quantity on the x-axis. And there's quantity. So we're going to start with a supply curve S, and then we're going to add in our demand curve, and this one is going to be D1. So I'm going to add in our original equilibrium point and where the level of price and quantity is at. So there's our intersection point. And this is going to be labelled PE1, so price equilibrium 1, and QE. So now we take the example of a change in consumer taste that leads to an increase in demand. This would see a rightward shift in the demand curve from D1 to D2, which we are going to draw now. And that is going to be labelled D2. So if we extend that line at price equilibrium 1, or price P1, we'll see that there's now a shortage of supply from point A to point B. Now we know from our equilibrium price and output video, which is linked in the description section below, that any price above or below an equilibrium price forces a move to a new equilibrium via free market forces. So therefore, the price will rise to PE2. We'll draw that in now. So this now intersects the supply curve. D2 now intersects the supply curve at point C. Follow this down. We'll call this new quantity supplied QE2. So we can see that this has caused a movement along the supply curve from point A to point C. We've also observed a movement along demand curve D2 from point B to point C. We'll draw that in now as well. See then that the equilibrium quantity has now risen from QE1 to QE2. So the overall effect of that rightward shift in the demand curve from D1 to D2, we can see has been a movement along the supply curve from equilibrium point A here to equilibrium point C.
Now we'll look at a change in supply. As you might expect, it's pretty much the opposite effect. Again, as described in our supply curve properties video, again, linked in the description, if a determinant of supply other than price changes, then the supply curve will shift. Logically, if the supply curve shifts, it will intersect the demand curve at a different point. So let's have a look at this on a graph.
This graph in a very similar setup to the previous graph. We have price on the x-axis, quantity on the y-axis, and we've got a simple demand curve, D, and supply curve, S1, and you can see that intersects at point A here, and that has price at price equilibrium 1, PE1, and we've got a quantity at QE1, quantity equilibrium. Now let's take, for example, a decision by the government to increase the general tax rate, which obviously would lead to a decrease in supply due to an increase in costs. So we'll see this by a leftward shift in the supply curve from S1 to S2, which we're about to draw now. So at the original price, PE1, we can now observe an excess of demand from point B to point A. So that is obviously at price equilibrium 1. The demand could easily suffice or could easily meet at point A, but due to the increase in taxes, we can see a shortage of that supply and therefore an excess of demand to point B. And again, from our equilibrium price and output video, we know that any price above or below an equilibrium price forces a move to a new equilibrium via free market forces. Therefore, we'll see the price rise from PE1 to PE2. That is where the new supply curve S2 intersects the original demand curve. We'll trace that along. We'll call that point C. That's now PE2. So what we'll also do is we'll just trace that down and find where the equilibrium quantity now lies. We'll call that QE2. Self-explanatory. So we can see that this has caused a movement along the demand curve from point A to point C. I'll just put an arrow for that movement. And it's also caused a movement along supply curve S2 from point B to point C. Again, I'll add an arrow just so you can see that more clearly. So the equilibrium quantity has therefore fallen from QE1 at equilibrium point A to QE2 at equilibrium point C. And this has obviously eliminated the excess we had from point B to point A, as we now have a new equilibrium at point C. Therefore, the overall effect of the decrease in supply, the leftward shift, and I'll just put arrows in for us here, the leftward shift in supply, the overall effect has been a movement along the demand curve from equilibrium point A to equilibrium point.
You may have noticed then that a shift in one curve causes a movement along the other curve to a new intersection point. Obviously, in the real world, there may be changes in both the supply and demand simultaneously. This would be shown in graph form as a shift in both curves, and the equilibrium would move from the point where the old curves intersected to the point where the new curves now intersect.
Which is something we're actually going to cover in a video that will be released a few weeks from now.
Yes.
So that's it for this video. We hope you've enjoyed it. We hope you've learned something as always. Keep an eye out for the videos that will be being released in the coming weeks. If you've enjoyed it, leave it a like, leave it a comment, and we hope to see you in those next videos.
Yeah. Thank you for watching.
Thanks for watching.